The rain hammered against the hangar windows like distant artillery fire, each drop a small percussion against glass that had witnessed decades of ceremonies just like this one. Inside, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in clinical white, 200 uniformed personnel stood in perfect formation, their dress blues immaculate, their faces forward, their expressions carefully neutral. But their eyes told a different story. They flicked sideways, curious and dismissive in equal measure, toward the figure standing alone near the back wall. He didn't belong there, or so the whispers suggested. A man in an ill-fitting suit that had seen better decades, holding the small hand of a girl no older than 6, her hair pulled into uneven pigtails that spoke of a father doing his best without quite knowing how. The little girl clutched a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, her thumb occasionally finding its way to her mouth before her father gently pulled it away. He was thin, almost gaunt, with the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones rather than just the eyes. Nobody knew his name. Nobody had asked. The ceremony was for heroes, for legends, for pilots who had written their names in contrails across hostile skies. This was the annual Naval Aviation Heritage Commemoration, where the ghosts of aces past were honored, and the living legends were celebrated with medals that caught the light like small suns. Admiral Vasquez hadn't arrived yet, which meant the junior officers were getting restless, shifting weight from foot to foot, wondering why they had to stand here staring at PowerPoint slides, cycling through grainy photographs of F-14 Tomcats and aerial refueling operations that predated most of their commissions. Near the front, Commander Reeves leaned slightly toward Lieutenant Ochoa. "Security getting lax," he muttered, barely moving his lips. "Who let the civilian in?" Ochoa's eyes found the man and child. "Maybe he's someone's guest. Dressed like that?" Reeves snorted softly. "Goodwill probably has better suits." The little girl dropped her rabbit. It hit the polished concrete with a soft thump that somehow carried in the vast space. Her father bent slowly, painfully, to retrieve it, and several officers exchanged glances that mixed pity with contempt. This was a place of excellence, of precision, of warriors who had earned their place through blood and skill. The man looked like he was barely surviving, let alone thriving. The ceremony began without fanfare, just the sharp bark of attention on deck that snapped every spine straight. Admiral Vasquez entered from the side door, his stride purposeful, his silver hair catching the overhead lights like a crown. He was a legend himself, a former strike fighter pilot who had flown combat missions in 3 separate conflicts, a man whose call sign, Hammer, had become synonymous with devastating precision. He took his position at the podium, his eyes scanning the formation with the kind of attention that missed nothing. His gaze passed over the rows of officers, the collection of retired aviators seated in folding chairs along the side wall, the banners hanging from the rafters representing squadrons both active and decommissioned. Then his eyes found the man in the bad suit, and something changed. It was subtle, just a fractional pause, a slight widening of the eyes, a breath held longer than necessary. The Admiral's jaw tightened, and his hand moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers brushing the rows of ribbons there as if checking they were still real, still earned, still true. Nobody else noticed. They were focused forward, waiting for the ceremony to begin, waiting for the speeches about valor and sacrifice that would sound identical to every other year's speeches. But Admiral Vasquez wasn't moving. He stood frozen at the podium, his prepared remarks forgotten, his eyes locked on the thin man who was gently adjusting his daughter's collar, trying to make her presentable, trying to shield her from the stares. "Sir," Captain Morrison whispered from beside the podium, concern creeping into his voice. The Admiral didn't respond. Instead, he stepped away from the podium, moving with sudden purpose, his shoes clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that demanded attention. The formation stirred, confusion rippling through the ranks like wind through wheat. Admiral Vasquez walked directly toward the back wall, toward the man everyone had dismissed, toward the little girl with the one-eared rabbit. Officers turned their heads, breaking formation protocol, trying to understand what was happening. The Admiral stopped 3 feet from the man, and in one fluid motion he came to attention with a precision that belonged to parade grounds and honor guards. Then he raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so perfect, so filled with weight that it seemed to pull gravity itself into alignment. The man in the bad suit stared, his eyes widening, his breath catching. His hand trembled as it rose slowly, mechanically, returning the salute with a form that spoke of muscle memory buried under years of exhaustion and survival. His fingers touched his forehead with the ghost of precision, and for just a moment, beneath the hollow cheeks and the tired eyes, something else showed through, something that had been a warrior once, something that had flown and fought and bled in skis most people would never see. The little girl looked up at her father, confusion and wonder mixing on her small face, not understanding why the room had gone so quiet, why 200 people were now staring, why this man with all the shiny things on his chest was standing so straight in front of her daddy. Admiral Vasquez held the salute for 5 full seconds, an eternity in military time, before dropping his hand and taking one step closer. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying in the silence, and the word hit like thunder because everyone knew it wasn't the man's civilian status being addressed. It was his rank, his earned rank, his real identity finally being acknowledged in a room that had dismissed him as nobody. "Captain Merrick," the Admiral continued, and now several of the older officers were stirring, recognition beginning to dawn because that name meant something. That name was attached to stories they had heard in ready rooms and over drinks, stories that seemed too impossible to be entirely true. "It's an honor, sir," Vasquez said, and there was weight in those words, genuine reverence that made several junior officers exchange confused glances because admirals didn't call captains sir. Not unless there was history there that transcended rank, history that mattered more than the medal on anyone's collar. Captain Merrick's jaw worked, trying to form words, but nothing came out except a small, broken sound that might have been the beginning of a sob or a laugh or something in between. His free hand, the one not holding his daughter's, moved to his face, wiping at eyes that had suddenly grown bright with moisture. "I didn't think anyone would remember," he finally managed, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. The Admiral's expression softened just slightly, the hard lines of command giving way to something more human. "Forget," he shook his head slowly. "Captain, there isn't a pilot in this room who doesn't owe their training doctrine to what you did over Kandahar. The Merrick maneuver is still being taught at Top Gun. They just don't tell the students it's named after a person anymore." He paused, his eyes moving to the little girl who was watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. "They don't tell them it's named after Wildcard." The call sign hit the room like a shockwave. Wildcard. Several officers gasped audibly, their carefully maintained composure cracking. Commander Reeves's face had gone pale, his earlier dismissive comments now hanging in the air like accusations against himself. Lieutenant Ochoa's mouth had fallen open, her eyes fixed on the thin man who suddenly seemed to occupy more space than his frame should allow. Captain Merrick Wildcard closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again they were distant, seeing something beyond the hangar walls, beyond the rain and the ceremony and the present moment. "That was a long time ago, Admiral," he said quietly. "I'm not that pilot anymore." "Maybe not," Vasquez acknowledged. "But you're still here, still standing, still raising her." His eyes moved to the little girl who was watching him with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl looked up at her father, seeking permission, and Merrick nodded slightly. "Riley," she said softly, holding up her rabbit, "and this is Captain Fluff." The Admiral's expression cracked into a genuine smile, the first warmth showing through his command bearing. "Well, Riley, your dad is one of the bravest pilots I've ever known." Riley's nose scrunched up. "Daddy doesn't fly anymore. He works at the store." The simple statement carried devastating weight, and several officers had the grace to look ashamed now, understanding beginning to dawn about how far this man had fallen, how much the service had failed to catch him. The Admiral straightened, his voice rising to carry through the entire hangar, no longer speaking just to Merrick but to everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to deviate from our planned ceremony. There's a story you all need to hear, a story that's been classified for 15 years but was recently declassified at my personal request." He gestured toward the front of the room. "Captain Merrick, would you please join me at the podium? And Riley, you come too. I think you should know what your father did." Merrick hesitated, his instinct clearly to refuse, to fade back into the anonymity he had wrapped around himself like armor. But the Admiral's eyes held him, and there was something in that gaze, understanding, respect, and an unspoken order that couldn't be ignored. Slowly, painfully, Merrick began walking forward, his daughter's hand still clutched in his own. The formation parted, officers stepping aside to create a path, their eyes following this thin man in his terrible suit as he moved toward the front of the hangar. Some faces showed confusion, others recognition, and a few showed something that might have been shame. When they reached the podium, the Admiral placed a hand on Merrick's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes to anyone who understood military protocol. Then he turned to address the room, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, of someone about to reveal a truth that had been buried too long. 15 years ago, in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a Taliban warlord named Khalid Mansur orchestrated an ambush on a convoy carrying 12 coalition officers, including a two-star general and representatives from 4 allied nations. The convoy was obliterated within minutes. No survivors, or so intelligence believed. He paused, letting the information settle. What we didn't know was that one officer survived the initial attack, Major Jennifer Solis of the Army Rangers, who was serving as the convoy's tactical advisor. She was badly wounded, trapped in a canyon with no extraction possible due to weather and enemy air defense systems that had already shot down 2 rescue helicopters. The rain continued its assault on the windows, but nobody in the hangar was paying attention to the weather anymore. Every eye was fixed on the Admiral, on the thin man beside him, on the story unfolding like a dark flower blooming in memory. "The rules of engagement were clear," Vasquez continued. "No aircraft were to enter that airspace until the air defense systems were neutralized. Command estimated it would take 72 hours to coordinate a proper strike package. Major Solis didn't have 72 hours. She had maybe 6, and even that was optimistic given the severity of her wounds and the temperature dropping below freezing." He turned to look at Merrick, and his voice softened. Lieutenant Commander Merrick was flying CAP that day, routine patrol in an FA-18 Super Hornet, call sign Wildcard. He wasn't part of any rescue operation. He wasn't authorized to engage. His aircraft was configured for air-to-air combat, not ground support. By every regulation, every protocol, every rule we had, he should have stayed out of it. The Admiral's hand tightened slightly on Merrick's shoulder. He didn't stay out of it. Merrick's eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow, and Riley was pressed against his leg, sensing something important was happening even if she didn't understand what. Wildcard heard Major Solis's distress call on guard frequency, Vasquez said. She was coherent enough to transmit her coordinates and situation. She knew she was dying. She was saying goodbye to her daughter. The word daughter echoed in the space, and several officers looked at Riley with new understanding, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together in ways that made the story more devastating. "Wildcard broke formation without authorization," the Admiral continued. "He flew into that canyon at 500 feet, below the engagement envelope of the air defense systems, with nothing but his guns and 2 AIM-9 missiles that were useless against ground targets. The canyon was barely wider than his wingspan. One mistake, one gust of wind, and he would have been debris." Commander Reeves was leaning forward now, his earlier contempt replaced by growing horror and awe. Lieutenant Ochoa had tears running down her cheeks, not bothering to wipe them away. The retired aviators along the wall were nodding slowly, recognizing the kind of flying being described, the kind of impossible choices that defined legends. "The Taliban had Major Solis pinned in a burned-out vehicle," Vasquez said. "They were advancing from 3 sides, taking their time because they knew no help was coming. They were wrong." He pulled a remote from his pocket and clicked it, and the PowerPoint screen behind him changed to display tactical footage, grainy, black and white, shot from what had to be a surveillance drone operating at high altitude. The timestamp read 15 years ago, the coordinates placing it deep in hostile territory. This footage was classified until last month, the Admiral explained. Watch. The screen showed a narrow canyon, steep walls rising on both sides, a thin trail of smoke marking where the convoy had been destroyed. Small figures, enemy fighters, were visible moving toward a dark shape that had to be the vehicle where Major Solis was trapped. Then, impossibly, an aircraft appeared at the bottom of the frame, flying so low its shadow merged with its fuselage. The FA-18 was moving at what had to be near stall speed, its nose pitched up slightly, every control surface working to keep it stable in the treacherous crosswinds that funneled through the canyon. "That's not possible," someone whispered in the formation, but they were wrong because it was right there on the screen, happening, recorded in pixels that couldn't lie. The Hornet's guns opened up, the camera capturing the muzzle flashes and the eruption of earth around the Taliban positions. The enemy fighters scattered, some falling, others diving for cover, their advance broken by the sudden violence from above. But the canyon was too narrow for the Hornet to maneuver effectively, and the aircraft shot past the ambush site, unable to make a second pass without gaining altitude and exposing itself to the air defense systems. The tactical footage continued, showing the Hornet climbing sharply, rocketing out of the canyon and into the open sky where death waited in the form of 3 separate SA-13 missile batteries that had been silent until now, waiting for exactly this opportunity. The screen lit up with missile launches, white contrails reaching upward like fingers trying to grab and pull down the aircraft that had dared to challenge them. Wildcard went active on all electronic countermeasures, the Admiral narrated, his voice carrying the tension of the moment even though everyone could see the outcome. Merrick was here alive, which meant he had survived. He dumped chaff and flares, executed a split test that should have torn the wings off his aircraft at that altitude, and somehow, evaded the first salvo of missiles. The footage showed the Hornet rolling inverted, diving back toward the earth at an angle that made several pilots in the audience wince and shake their heads. The missiles tracked, adjusting, 2 of them detonating close enough that the camera caught the flash and the aircraft disappearing momentarily into the fireball. But when the smoke cleared, the Hornet was still there, still flying, bleeding speed and altitude but intact. "He went back into the canyon," Vasquez said, and his voice carried something like reverence now. "With his aircraft damaged, hydraulics failing, and every alarm in the cockpit screaming at him, he went back in." The screen showed it happening, the wounded Hornet dropping back into that narrow slot between the canyon walls, slower now, more erratic but still under control. The Taliban fighters had regrouped, were advancing again, but this time Wildcard didn't use his guns. Instead, he did something that made the Admiral pause the footage and turn to face the room directly. "What you're about to see was analyzed by every tactical instructor at Top Gun," he said. "It's been studied, debated, and incorporated into training doctrine. It's also been called impossible by 3 separate accident investigation boards who reviewed the footage." The Admiral resumed the playback. The Hornet dropped even lower, its landing gear deploying, a move that made no sense because there was nowhere to land. The canyon floor was jagged rock and burning vehicles. But Wildcard wasn't landing. He was using the gear as an improvised weapon, dragging the wheels along the canyon wall where the Taliban fighters had taken cover, the metal shrieking against stone, throwing up sparks and debris that scattered the enemy like leaves in a hurricane. The maneuver was insane, suicidal, and absolutely brilliant. The canyon wall caught the landing gear and tried to rip it free, but somehow Wildcard maintained just enough control to prevent the aircraft from cartwheeling into the ground. He pulled up sharply, the gear retracting partially, damaged now but still functional, and the Hornet climbed out of the canyon one final time. Major Solis transmitted that the enemy had retreated, Vasquez said. She had maybe 30 minutes before they would regroup and come back. Wildcard called for immediate extraction, but command refused. The air defense systems were still active, the weather was deteriorating, and sending a helicopter would be sending it to be shot down. Merrick's eyes opened, focusing on some middle distance, seeing the memory rather than the hangar. His voice came out rough, barely audible, but the microphone caught it. "I couldn't leave her there." The Admiral nodded. "No, you couldn't. So you made a choice that ended your career and saved a life." He gestured to the screen, which now showed the Hornet descending again, but this time not into the canyon. It was heading for a slightly wider section of the valley floor, a stretch of maybe 1,000 feet that was less rocks and more hard-packed earth. Wildcard put his FA-18 Super Hornet down in a space designed for helicopters, using a landing profile that doesn't exist in any manual because it's not supposed to be possible, the Admiral said. His approach speed was too high, his landing distance too short, and his damaged gear barely holding together. The footage showed it all. The Hornet touching down hard, bouncing once, the pilot fighting to keep it straight as the gear threatened to collapse, the brakes screaming, the aircraft sliding the last 100 feet before finally stopping with maybe 50 feet to spare before the terrain turned lethal. The entire hangar was silent except for the rain, and the quiet sounds of grown warriors trying not to weep at what they were witnessing. Wildcard shut down his engines, grabbed his survival kit and sidearm, and ran half a mile under enemy fire to reach Major Solis, Vasquez continued. He stabilized her wounds, administered morphine, and carried her back to his aircraft. Then he strapped her into the only seat, his seat, while he wedged himself into the space behind the ejection seat, a space not designed for human occupation during flight. The Admiral's voice grew quieter, more intimate, speaking directly to Merrick now though his words carried to everyone. "You had no rear visibility, no ejection capability, and an aircraft that was barely flyable. You performed a combat takeoff with twice the weight you were rated for, cleared the valley floor by less than 50 feet, and flew 200 miles to the nearest friendly base with your aircraft falling apart around you." Merrick's face had gone pale, the memories clearly costing him something to relive. Riley had wrapped both arms around his leg, holding on as if sensing her father needed anchoring. "The landing killed your aircraft," Vasquez said. "The gear collapsed on touchdown, you slid for a quarter mile on the aircraft's belly, and the fire crews had to cut you both out. Major Solis survived. Lost her leg, but she survived. She recovered, returned to duty for 3 more years, then retired to raise her daughter." The Admiral paused, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. "Her daughter Riley, who was 4 years old when her mother deployed and whose last transmission to her mom had been played on that guard frequency. The transmission that Wildcard heard, the words, 'I love you, Mommy. Come home,' that convinced him that rules didn't matter as much as a little girl getting her mother back." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The little girl holding Merrick's hand wasn't his daughter by birth. Riley was Major Solis's daughter, and Merrick was raising her because. The thought was too terrible to complete, but several people in the room were doing the math, were understanding that something had happened after the rescue, something that had left this hero caring for the child of the woman he had saved. Major Solis, Colonel Solis, by the time she retired, had breast cancer, the Admiral said, confirming what many had already guessed. Diagnosed 2 years after the rescue, the injuries from the ambush had delayed detection. By the time they found it, it had metastasized. She fought for 6 years, and in that time she and Wildcard became family. When she knew she wasn't going to make it, she asked him to raise Riley. He resigned his commission, gave up flying, and has spent the last 4 years working 3 jobs to keep Riley fed, clothed, and in school while navigating a VA system that somehow lost track of his service record. The Admiral's jaw tightened with anger barely held in check. This man, who performed one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in naval aviation history, who saved a decorated officer and gave a little girl her mother back for 6 more years, has been living below the poverty line because bureaucracy failed him. He was here today because Riley's school is doing a project on heroes, and she wanted to see real pilots, and he scraped together enough money for bus fare to bring her. Several officers were openly crying now. Commander Reeves had his hand over his face, his shoulders shaking. Captain Morrison was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cables. The court-martial for violating orders was suspended due to the extraordinary circumstances, Vasquez continued. But the damage was done. Wildcard was labeled reckless, a cowboy, someone who couldn't follow rules. His career was effectively over even though he was never formally charged. He resigned rather than fight it because Colonel Solis needed someone, and fighting would have taken time he didn't have. The Admiral turned to face Merrick fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried command authority that transcended rank or circumstance. Captain Merrick, by the authority vested in me as Commander of Naval Air Forces Pacific, and with the concurrence of the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy, I'm hereby restoring you to active duty at your proper rank of captain, with full back pay and benefits, effective immediately. Merrick's eyes widened, his mouth opening but no sound emerging. Riley looked up at her father, not understanding the words but feeling the weight of them. Furthermore, Vasquez continued, pulling a small box from his pocket, you are hereby awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat, an award that should have been presented 15 years ago, but was delayed due to the classified nature of your mission. He opened the box to reveal the distinctive ribbon and medal, the Navy's second highest decoration for valor. And finally, the Admiral said, his voice breaking slightly, every officer present is required to render you the honors befitting your rank and your sacrifice. He stepped back and came to attention again, his salute sharp and perfect. Behind him, Captain Morrison called out, attention on deck, present arms. 200 officers moved as one, their hands rising in salute, holding the position, the silence broken only by rain and the muffled sounds of grown warriors weeping for a hero they had dismissed as nobody. Merrick stood frozen, overwhelmed, his thin frame seeming to simultaneously collapse and expand, the weight of years of struggle meeting the sudden recognition that he wasn't forgotten, wasn't nothing, wasn't just a poor single dad in a bad suit. His hand rose shakily to return the salute, and this time there was no hesitation in the movement, no trembling doubt. For just a moment, standing at attention with his daughter pressed against his leg and 200 pilots honoring his sacrifice, Captain Merrick was wildcard again, not the pilot who had fallen, but the one who had never stopped flying, even after the sky was taken from him. The salute held for 10 full seconds, an eternity of respect and recognition before the Admiral called, "Order arms," and the hands dropped in unison. But nobody moved, nobody broke formation, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Riley tugged on her father's jacket. "Daddy, why is everyone looking at you?" Merrick looked down at his daughter, no, at Jennifer's daughter, at the little girl whose mother he had flown through hell to save, whose mother had spent her last breaths asking him to be strong, to be a father, to give Riley the life she deserved even though he didn't know how, even though he was broken himself. Because sometimes, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, people remember that we're supposed to take care of each other. The Admiral gestured toward the front row of seats. "Captain, please sit. You and Riley. We need to finish this ceremony properly and there are things you need to hear." Merrick nodded, unable to trust his voice for more, and led Riley to the indicated seats. As they passed through the formation, several officers reached out to touch his shoulder, brief contacts that carried more meaning than words: respect, apology, solidarity. When they were seated, Riley holding her one-eared rabbit and looking around with wide eyes at all the serious faces, the Admiral returned to the podium and continued the ceremony. But it was different now. Every award presented, every story told, every pilot honored was placed in new context. They had done extraordinary things, flown dangerous missions, pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But they had also operated within the system, with support and recognition and the full weight of the military behind them. Wildcard had flown alone, against orders, with nothing but his skill and his conscience telling him that a little girl deserved her mother more than he deserved to follow rules. The ceremony lasted another hour, but nobody's attention wavered. They were seeing their profession differently now, understanding that the medals and the glory and the recognition were nice, but they weren't the point. The point was what you did when nobody was watching, when there would be no reward, when doing the right thing meant losing everything. When it finally concluded, Admiral Vasquez made one final announcement. There will be a reception in the officers' club. Captain Merrick, you are the guest of honor. And before anyone asks, yes, your suit is fine. It's the man wearing it that matters. He smiled slightly. Though we do have a dress uniform in your size waiting for you if you'd like to change. It's been waiting for 15 years. The formation dismissed, but nobody rushed for the doors. Instead, they converged on Merrick, a crowd of pilots wanting to shake his hand, wanting to hear the story from his own lips, wanting to be close to someone who embodied everything they aspired to be. Riley was swept up by a female F-35 pilot who introduced herself as Viper and proceeded to tell the little girl about her own call sign story, making her laugh with exaggerated gestures and silly voices. Commander Reeves approached, his face showing genuine contrition. Captain Merrick, I owe you an apology. I said some things before I knew. Merrick cut him off with a shake of his head. You didn't know, nobody knew, that's how I wanted it. But, Commander, I've spent 4 years being invisible. It was easier that way. Fewer questions, fewer memories, fewer expectations. Merrick's eyes were tired but clear. The only thing that mattered was making sure Riley was okay. Everything else could burn. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding but clearly struggling with the weight of his earlier judgment. For what it's worth, sir, what you did, both in combat and after, that's real courage. We wear the uniform, but you lived it. The reception was unlike any military function Merrick had ever attended. People wanted to hear about the rescue, about the landing, about how he had kept the aircraft flying with hydraulics failing and the controls responding like wet concrete. He answered their questions in short, factual sentences, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to refuse it after the Admiral had made it clear. This was part of his restoration to the community he had lost. But the real conversations happened in the quiet corners, away from the crowd. A young lieutenant approached hesitantly, her face showing uncertainty. Captain, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a question that's not about the combat mission. Merrick gestured for her to continue, and she took a breath before speaking. How did you keep going? After everything, losing your career, losing Colonel Solis, taking on Riley while dealing with your own trauma. The VA, the bureaucracy, the poverty. How did you not just give up? Merrick was quiet for a long moment, watching Riley across the room playing with a helmet someone had given her, her face bright with joy. There were days I wanted to, he admitted. Days when the alarm went off and I couldn't remember why getting up mattered. Days when the bills were impossible and Riley needed new shoes and I couldn't afford both her shoes and my medication. Days when the sky outside my apartment window felt like it was mocking me, reminding me of what I'd lost. He paused, his throat working. But then Riley would come out of her room with her hair a mess and ask me to fix her pigtails, and she'd look at me like I was capable of anything, like I was still wild card even though I was just a guy who worked at a grocery store stocking shelves at 4 in the morning. And I realized that Jennifer had trusted me with the most important mission of my life. Not the rescue, that was easy compared to this. She trusted me to show Riley that the world isn't just loss and pain, that there are people who keep their promises even when it's hard, even when nobody's watching. The lieutenant's eyes were bright with tears. My dad was a pilot. He died in a training accident when I was 7. My mom raised me alone, working as a waitress because the military didn't take care of her properly after he died. She never complained, never blamed anyone, just kept showing up for me every single day. She wiped at her face. I think I understand what you mean about the real mission. Merrick nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was both paternal and fraternal. Your mom's a hero. Maybe not the kind who gets medals, but the kind who matters most. Tell her that if you haven't already. Across the room, Admiral Vasquez was talking to Riley, who was explaining in great detail about Captain Fluff and his adventures. The Admiral listened with genuine attention, asking questions that made Riley giggle and elaborate on increasingly improbable rabbit heroics. When Merrick approached, the Admiral stood and smiled. "She's amazing. Jennifer would be proud." "She is amazing," Merrick agreed, and Jennifer was proud right up until the end. She told me that Riley had saved her just as much as I did, given her a reason to fight longer than she should have been able to. Vasquez's expression grew serious. "I meant what I said about restoration to active duty. It's not just symbolic. We've set up a position for you as an instructor at Top Gun. The Merrick maneuver needs to be taught by the man who invented it. And the pay, the benefits, the housing, it's all real. You're not going back to that apartment or that grocery store unless you want to." Merrick felt tears threatening, his composure cracking after hours of holding everything together. "I don't know if I can fly again. It's been so long, and my medical status." "We'll work through it," the Admiral interrupted gently. "If you can fly, we'll get you current. If you can't, you teach from the ground. Either way, you're needed. Your experience, your judgment, your ability to see the mission beyond the rules, that's what we need to teach the next generation. They can learn procedures anywhere. They need to learn courage from someone who's lived it." Riley tugged on Merrick's sleeve. "Daddy, the Admiral said I can come to the museum on base and sit in a real airplane. Can we do that?" Merrick looked at his daughter, at the joy and excitement in her eyes, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. "Sweetheart, we can do that." The reception continued into the evening, the rain eventually stopping, the sky clearing to reveal stars that seemed impossibly bright after the storm. Merrick found himself standing outside the officers' club, looking up at those stars, thinking about all the nights he had flown among them, feeling like he belonged to something bigger than himself. A figure joined him, Captain Morrison, holding 2 cups of coffee and offering one. "Figured you could use this. It's been quite a day." Merrick accepted the cup gratefully. That's an understatement. Morrison was quiet for a moment, just standing there in companionable silence before speaking. "I was in the ready room when your court-martial was being discussed. I was a lieutenant then, didn't have any say in the matter, but I remember thinking the whole thing was wrong. You saved a life. That should have been the only thing that mattered." "The military doesn't work that way," Merrick said without bitterness. "Rules exist for good reasons. I broke them, there were consequences." "Were they worth it?" Morrison asked. "The consequences, I mean. Looking back, knowing everything that came after the lost career, the struggle, the years of poverty and fighting bureaucracy, was it worth it?" Merrick didn't hesitate. "Every second. Jennifer got 6 more years with Riley. 6 birthdays, 6 Christmases, 6 years of bedtime stories and homework help, and teaching her daughter to be strong and kind. Riley was 4 when I pulled her mother out of that canyon. She's 10 now, and she has memories of her mother that will last forever. That's worth any price." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's the right answer. It's also the answer that makes you the best possible instructor for our pilots, because you understand that the mission isn't about the aircraft or the weapons or even the tactics. It's about the people, always the people." Inside, Riley's laughter rang out, bright and pure, cutting through the adult conversations and the military formality. Both men turned to look through the window, seeing her dancing with Viper, the F-35 pilot having completely abandoned her professional demeanor to play with a 10-year-old who needed joy more than she needed speeches about honor. "She's resilient," Morrison observed. "Jennifer raised her well, and you've carried on that work." "I'm doing my best," Merrick said quietly. "Some days are better than others. She still has nightmares about losing her mom. She still asks questions I don't have answers for. She still looks at other kids with 2 parents and wonders why she doesn't have that." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But she's strong, stronger than me. She's going to be okay." "She's going to be."